So I'm gonna talk to you guys about REST APIs. I think kind of seeing that who's worked with like some sort of backend language at all. Okay, cool. Does everybody here know JavaScript? Anybody not know JavaScript by chance? That's great news. Okay, cool. So I'll kind of blow through these as quick as I can. This is me. I'm Chris. I just moved here from Nashville not too long ago. Things I like: full stack web development. Sorry, this is so loud. And open source technology. So goals for this talk: what is REST? Why I think we should probably have a good understanding of what it is, and then a practical example. So REST is pretty much you have verbs, HTTP verbs, and then you have data associated with those verbs, and then you have what's called a URI, which is a Uniform Resource Index. And so when you're dealing with the browser, you have these different verbs: post, get, put, delete, which is essentially CRUD. If you haven't heard that term, create, read, update, delete. And then data associated with each one of those verbs, and so you can kind of see it like in a linear fashion there. And the URI or URL, depending on how you want to look at it, that you send that data to. And then you have your API, which is an application programming interface. I couldn't really find a good definition for it, so this is kind of what I came up with, which is a set of predefined exposed methods to enhance and quickly develop apps. So why do we want to have a good concept of REST? Basically, we're coming out with all these amazing front-end frameworks, and how these front-end frameworks work is when the page loads, it runs a bunch of JavaScript, kind of bootstraps the entire application, and then you want the rest of the data to be handled on the client side. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly reloading these applications. And so if we're kind of in a point where technology is so advanced, we're in a sense reverse engineering. So we're working from the user experience, and then we're kind of developing around the user experience instead of figuring out what technology do I want to work with and then trying to make it work for the user after that, which I think is a really important part of having a front end that's well equipped and then also having a back end that's well equipped. And so you're pretty much saying, I don't want to use you guys. Okay. So, like I said, I'm going to run through this kind of quick. All in all, this is going to be in a GitHub repository. I have 3 replicates of the same file, one with no comments, one with like extremely detailed comments. So I'm going to do the one with just steps. So basically, we have an app variable, and then we're instantiating it with the express function, which is, so there's only 3 dependencies in this whole project. We have Express, Body Parser, and Mongoose. Express, if you don't know, is just a web server. So if you start it up, go to a URL, it's going to send something back. That's pretty much all that means. And Mongoose is what's called an ORM, which is Object Relational Model Mapping. I don't even remember. I always forget. Anyway, so we're going to be working with what's called Mongodb, which is a NoSQL database. So you basically bootstrap your server to an app variable, and what that does is that's going to give you a bunch of methods that you can use for your web server: get, post, delete, all that good stuff. And so first, we're going to use Body Parser as a middleware. You're basically telling your application, hey, most of the data that I'm going to be sending back forth is in JSON or JavaScript object notation format. And then the URL encoded is basically saying, I want to be able to have nested data. We're not going to be using any nested data, but I pretty much always set that to true. And then the Mongoose instance that's going to be running on my computer, by default, it's set to port, or not port, the host 127001. And I'm just calling this FCC API database. And so kind of something that I kind of wanted to do. So when I first started learning about databases and backend, it was like kind of intimidating. I just considered myself like a front-end developer, and that's, you know, if I send something to you, just send me the right stuff back, and that was all I was concerned about. But I kind of grew more interested in how that data was being gathered and how how that was working, because it was able to help me as a front-end developer expect what I'm going to get back and then handle that. And so pretty much the reason I like Mongoose is because it's all JavaScript or Node-based, and so a lot of the abstractions and all the syntax is pretty similar. So basically, all we're going to do is we're just going to have a user with just a name, so it's just a regular JavaScript object, and then Mongoose has a method called schema, and then all we're doing is putting that object that we just created inside of that schema function. And then we're also going to have a model method, and then we're going to assign that to a user model variable. And then this user model variable is what as you're about to see, what we're going to use for all of our REST methods that we're going to use. So basically, the syntax for Express is you do app.get, and then you do the URI, and then that sends back a request and response, which is typically by convention abbreviated to REQ and RES. And right now, all I'm doing is serving up an HTML file, which you'll see in a second. And then basically, from that HTML file, we're going to be doing a post request to users. So it's going to be whatever the host and port is that you're hosting on, and then it's going to be the extension users. And then you're going to say, okay, whenever somebody does a post request to this URI, we're going to do a new user object, and then we're going to send it the whole request.body, which is whatever you send it and whatever type of form that you have on the front end. So it's basically saying everything that's in this form that you send it, just make that a model. And then Mongoose gives you a whole slew of methods that you can use for just easily implementing, like saving and deleting and finding users. So new user object.save, which is an extension of the user model, is giving us that method. And we're not doing any error handling right now. So sorry, Gerald, I know that's what you're thinking. App.get, so basically get all the users. And then for updating users, again, Mongoose has really nice syntax and methods. So find by ID and update. And so pretty much we have this little :ID here for Express. And basically what that's saying is you don't want to have an individual method for every single ID for every user in the database, because that would just be ridiculous. So that's essentially your variable that you're passing to it. And then Express is going to make that available for you in the request object in request.params.id. And then app.delete, which is again the delete HTTP verb. Whenever somebody sends it to like /users/ blah, 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 whatever Mongoose gives us, then you can just use the find by ID and remove method from Mongoose. And then finally, we're just going to open up on port 3000, and then we're going to do a callback function saying, hey, we're listening, which is what I did. I'll restart real quick, which is essentially what we're doing right here. And so to kind of give an example of this, I'm sure if you've worked with APIs, you probably use like Postman. And so what I did is I made a really contrived example of Postman. And so if you wanted to have a user, so this is actually posting with Mongoose to a MongoDB instance running on my computer. And so every time you hit post, it's creating a new user, Mongoose assigns it a new ID, and then you can do whatever you want with it. So we'll do a few more posts, and then just as an example, so you can take this ID here, and then if you remember over here, when we were doing our delete, we say users, and then we're gonna pass in whatever ID we want, and then it's gonna find that in the params, and then it's gonna remove it. So if we wanna remove this one, and this is already just predefined here, then it's gonna ignore this data because we don't, I mean, again, contrived example, but since we're passing in the ID, we don't need any data to be passed to it, and then once we hit delete, it just takes it out. So REST is essentially a standard of retrieving data, not only retrieving data, but also interacting with data in the database. Apps are becoming more and more focused on the user, not so much the ease and comfort of the developers. It's not impossible to learn. It's actually pretty easy, especially if you're using Node, because Free Code Camp is like 100% JavaScript nowadays. Well, I shouldn't say 100%. Can you tell like I'm a little biased about JavaScript? But anyway, and so that's all I got. If you guys are interested in kind of this little running example, my GitHub username is Mr. Christofferson, and it'll be /fcc-API. And I think that's all I got. That is all I got. Anybody have any quick questions? Okay, good.